So I hope this is sort of a new wrinkle on the matching problem, which I talked about in the 2020 paper, Is Evolutionary Psychology Possible? Which is a particular zoomed in issue that I'm still thinking about. So this is a very fresh and yet to be refined, if that's ever done in philosophy, example of what I hope to become a fully developed idea. So one of the things that I'm interested in when I engage with questions about evolutionary psychology is really trying to try and make sense, given the explicit assertions, with those kind of background assumptions, which must be animating the projects that are evolutionary psychology in particular. But there's also this very general concern with moves, with attempts to give evolutionary accounts of human behavior. There's something about the nature of behavior that I wonder if behaviors are apt for evolutionary analysis. And so I'm always engaging in a way to try and see if I can make sense of what's sort of under the hood. If I open the hood, will I get some either to be articulated insights that will probably change my perspective from being an ardent, I don't think that this is a workable framework, to, okay, there's something here. Okay, I start with my model organisms. They're one of 3 model organisms I traffic in, the man of war, honeybees, and human beings. And I'm endlessly fascinated by the range of behavioral repertoire that human beings exhibit. And so it's always a good thing to start a presentation with lots of images of human beings. So the setup is roughly like this. I'll say something about what's to be gained in the title of the talk. One way of thinking about the title of the talk is it's just a way to get into my subject, but I think that there's something substantive that needs to be addressed. So first I'll try and say something about what's to be gained. Then I'll move to looking at 2 accounts, or at least 2 quotes of the utility of evolutionary accounts of human behavior. Generally thought. So sometimes when I give these talks, people get uncomfortable with the criticisms that I levy at evolutionary psychologists, and they want to sort of find ways to neutralize my comments. And one of the ways in which they seek to do that is to, for instance, look at particular claims. And I'm usually interested in particular claims, but really the framework is my target. And so someone will say, well, that person said that last week, but we've moved on from there, and now this is the sort of new claims that you really should be attending to. Or if I don't have any quotes, then people have issues with that too. So I like to sort of have people speak for themselves. Here are the views. Don't take my words for it. I am in fact engaged with real people with real views. Following which, I'll say something about the epistemic posture, as I call it, that I think the epistemic posture is supposed to be what one gets from an evolutionary perspective on human behavior. And that posture is at once theoretical, and it also might have some practical import for the sorts of projects that people are interested in. I shift gears to talk about the challenges. In order for this epistemic posturing to succeed, and therefore for evolutionary accounts of human behavior to go through, then I see this epistemic gap as one that must be, and so I want to sort of talk a little bit about the particular version of the epistemic gap that I'm interested in. And that, of course, leads us back to the matching problem. It's really, the matching problem is a large issue that's at stake. The epistemic gap, narrowly construed in this paper, is what I'll be talking about, but I'll end the paper by saying something more about the epistemic, the magic problem. First issue, what's to be gained? Very generally, we might imagine that there's something like an enriched conceptual understanding. What do I mean by that? It's very clear that there is over and above the target of trying to figure out what evolution can help us say about human behavior. There's this large target that people are wanting to say something about human beings in general or human nature. And so this idea here is that the conceptual framework that we utilize in thinking about issues having to do with human behaviors in particular and human beings in general, seeing as possessing a nature that enters into things like how we live our lives, that's going to be a gain, right? It's of course going to be positive that we understand, oh, now why we behave in these ways. But we behave in these ways, not just because we're a certain kind of animal, but because we are a certain kind of animal, not because we're animal, but because we're a certain kind of animal possessed of certain faculties, certain kinds of dispositions. And if we can decompose, if you like, if we can conceptualize those dispositions, then of course, what we have to say in any particular arena about human beings and their behaviors in particular is really going to be more contentful. Part of what's going on here is people don't want to just be flapping their wings. They want to have real contentful claims that they're making. And I also think that they wish for these claims to have, in some sense, empirical bona fides, right? Of course, we can always talk about rationality, and perhaps as an example of that, we might look to the fact that we do engage in rational discourses, right? We can engage in logic and mathematics, and we can engage in linguistic gymnastics and the like. These are examples of our ability, our disposition as rational agents. But there is this sort of ephemeral thing, human nature, which no one has yet been able to pin down in any ordinary sense. It's controversial because there is no univocal account of what it is supposed to be. So perhaps if we are able in some sense to conceptualize human nature and human behavior in such a way that the concepts are so independent, perhaps that will stand in the place of something empirical, right? It's all hand wavy, I think. I think in the end it's hand wavy, but I think that there is a great deal of effort to try and toggle human nature down to something that is substantive. I also think that another really important issue from what's to be gained is this idea of our understanding the sorts of constraints that are imposed on human beings. I think the evolutionary take on human behavior is one that of necessity always brings along, and therefore what we probably are not, what sorts of systems we probably ought not to be trying to build given the constraints that are placed on us. And we find these discussions in domains that are essential to our lives. People talk about, the IQ debate is always part of this issue with respect to issues of gender and sex. The constraint is sort of multi-layered because there's sort of constraints on what it is to be a human being, simpliciter, but then there might be quite specific claims that we want to make about what it is to be a human female. Of course, we know that these issues find themselves very often in the race debate. So people will be saying things about what it is, what kinds of capabilities that racialized people are said to have as a matter of their evolved history. Now, not many people around will put their hands up and declare that there are different evolutionary paths for the different races, I really don't think we have apologetists walking around, but we have arguments that, again, I think some of those arguments are at least suspect with respect to what's going on. So I think what's to be gained could be summarized generally as enriching our conceptual theoretical frames, those that we will use ultimately to think about and answer questions about human beings. And secondarily, we will come to understand, on account of what we've learned by this enriched conceptual framework, the sorts of constraints that are imposed on human beings on account of evolution. In case one is on the fence about whether it really is the case that the sort of targets I'm after are real targets, here are two examples of the sorts of things that evolutionary psychologists are apt to say. Quote, evolutionary psychologists have positive evolutionary explanations for a broad range of domain-specific mechanisms, including sexual jealousy, aggression, social exchange, and morality. And that's Brown et al. 2011. Now, what I think is interesting here about in this quote is the range, a broad range of domain-specific mechanisms. Of course, the sort of massive modularity framework is sort of being alluded to here. These domain-specific mechanisms are aimed at not any old thing, but quite specific targets. And these targets, as we know from classic quote from Cosmedi and Tooby, these are targets that would have some import for fitness with respect, early humans' fitness. It's not the case that these domain-specific mechanisms will target, I don't know, for instance, a preference for a particular flavor ice cream. That might be seen as something foolish, but these domain-specific target might be said to underwrite our preference, for instance, for sweet foods on account of the idea that we get calories enriched foods that are sweet are likely to be enriched in calories, and calories would have been and still remains a central target just for being alive. Of course, it is always important to remind the audience that these claims are made with respect, not so much to contemporary human beings. Yes, they are. But in the first place, these claims are intended to say something about our ancestors, because after all, the claim is about the emergence and the fact that we have these domain-specific mechanisms to begin with. It means that they had to have been laid down. And after all, they weren't laid down last week. They were laid down a very long time ago, perhaps 300,000 years ago or so. The second quote, risky decision-making may not be a unitary phenomenon. It might fractionate into several more evolutionarily specialized subdomains, each activating different evolved decision-making principles. And that's from Amir, Cosmedi, and Tooby. Now, both of these quotes target very large behavioral domain. There's sort of no specific kind of behavior that is enumerated apart from sexual jealousy. So the category then is something like sexual jealousy. The target isn't a specific kind of behavior that would be had by enough people in a population such that we would say that and only that kind of behavior is an example of sexual jealousy. And to be fair, evolutionary psychologists are apt to say that the mechanisms are what we're talking about, and the ways in which these mechanisms ramify themselves in particular contexts will be different. But very generally, the different ways in which they flow out will, in some sense, end up in what I call sort of the particular mechanism river, right? So if the target here is sexual jealousy, what will unite all of the range of behaviors that fall under that category is something having to do with sexual jealousy. I said earlier that the gain, one of the gain is sort of this enriched conceptual framework. And I'm sort of returning to this idea here in the form of talking about epistemic posturing. As with all scientists, evolutionary psychologists in particular, and evolutionary theoreticians generally, are in the epistemic business. They are interested in gaining knowledge about the world. And this knowledge that they gain can be of utility for real life purposes, or they can be of utility just because. One might argue that a lot of the things that we're doing in our studies and research, those of us in academia, that these are not work that most people would think is of any direct import, right? Any practical import. But nonetheless, we still pursue our projects. There are plenty of logicians who are logicianing away with not a thought as to whether or not this will be practical for someone getting a job or not. But that's irrelevant to the fact that we do gain knowledge about a region of the world. So our theories about extant human beings can have a confident stature, just in case those theories are correct, those theories are true, those theories are theories that are have observational content, and that those observational content are ones that, in principle, we can get access to. Now, of course, evolutionary claims are about extant humans, but they are about us by thinking about the past. And so the presuppositions about the past, the ways in which our ancestors lived their lives, the sorts of pressures they experienced, the ways in which they navigated around those pressures, are facts about their evolutionary history, and in some sense, facts about who we are. Evolutionary psychologists in particular don't merely want to say that we are related to our ancestors because, well, they're our ancestors. Rather, they purport to be giving us knowledge claims about specific aspects of our lives. Now, to my mind, that is what I call real skin in the game epistemic matters. So the question then, if this is not cheap epistemology, if this is supposed to be, these claims are supposed to be contentful, and they are supposed to be contentful, how are we to get behind them, support them, or believe that these are epistemically contentful? There are a number of ways in which evolutionary psychologists and others have sought to establish the facts of their claims, or to show that their claims have empirical bona fides. But it's not clear at all how some of these claims could ever really be tested. And so the epistemic posture that is assumed to be gained from an evolutionary stance on human behavior, to my mind, is consequential, and it's not, to my mind, one that has been successfully satisfied. Beyond the mere theoretical, consequential sort of epistemic staturing, we can stand taller because we know that X is the case. there really is a matter of the practical import. It really, really, really is significant that we can make assertions about the likelihood or not that because of the evolutionary pressures that our ancestors faced, that our lives in the contemporary world should be structured in a particular kind of way. Should we be making it so that all female human beings, for instance, can have unhindered access to any kind of education they wish? Or should we really be thinking in terms of the practicality of utilizing our resources for targets or for ends that we might get some successes from? But the fact is, these successes will always be limited because there are, as I said earlier, some constraints on human beings with respect to these matters. Now, some of you here might very well be saying, I cannot believe what this woman is saying, because surely no one takes these positions. And, we don't have enough time, nor do I have enough interest to reel out some of the very many claims that evolutionary psychologists have made that seems to be just extraordinary with respect to these issues. So I'm giving you a flavor of what I think is going on. Some of these claims have been asserted explicitly, but some of these have not. The fact that they all think that they are epistemically better off, that we're all in a better situation for undergirding our claims about who we are in evolution, under evolution, and that such undergirding is going to be a theoretical enforcer of what we can say and do, and a practical enforcer, or at least a practical element to consider in some of what we can do, I think is a substantive and important matter. To this sort of posturing, I'm apt to, when I'm engaging with people who are disposed to bring evolution to the table, when we're talking about these matters, I'm apt to solicit answers to questions about the challenges as I see them. In the framework, there are quite explicit claims about facts having to do with us and them. And these facts having to do with us and them, our ancestors, are facts that we need to establish in order for us to move on and support these claims. So getting past those, I think, is to close the epistemic gap. The candidate mechanisms or behaviors, depending on how sloppy the speaker or writer is, but the candidate mechanisms must, in my view, be such that we're able to escape ultimately the matching problem. So we have got to be able to show that we are not epistemically constrained with respect to understanding the relationship between the mechanisms that were had by our ancestors and the mechanisms that are currently had by contemporary human beings. Remember, all of this is on the back of a claim of the three candidate claims that natural selection has fitted the human mind with specialized structures fashioned for particular jobs, that the structures were and are sensitive to fitness benefiting stimuli, that the structures in extant humans are attuned to the past contingencies that our ancestors faced. And these are real consequential claims that I hope I will show you are hard to meet. Further, we have, in addition to those claims, Cosmides and Toobies, often, at least used by me, quote, that the modern skulls that we have house a Stone Age mind. And I like to say to my students that the computing device, the software itself is old, but the hardware, the skull, the enclosed system is is modern. Our brains, our skulls are nicely shaped. I understand when babies are born, doctors are apt to make sure that that malleable skull is such that the baby's heads aren't ill-shaped. This won't be good for being a teenager in a schoolyard with an ill-shaped head. So they're very careful as to make sure that heads are not problematically shaped. But in doing any kind of adjustments that they might do because of how soft and malleable the skull is, they won't be able to do anything to the brain itself, because the brain is itself old. They go on to say that very sophisticated computers whose circuits are elegantly designed to solve the kinds of problems our ancestors routinely faced, and thus behavior in the present is generated by information processing modules that exist because they solved adaptive problems in the past. Pretty standard stuff and pretty interesting stuff. Now, the nature of the epistemic gap, as I see it, is what I call the genetic claim. And I take this to be the genetic claim from the previous quote, that behavior in the present is generated by information processing modules that exist because they solved adaptive problems in the past. They are generated by information processing modules. It is important to emphasize that this claim is about inheritance of relevant genetic platform, which itself has produced and fashioned these modules or these structures to be what they were and to be what they are. There is no contesting that the genes themselves have not changed since they were laid down. Well, I don't know if I would say there's no contesting, but the assertion is that the genes have not been modified in the relevant ways as they were initially laid down, and they are in the business, along with the developmental processes that bring about structures. They have continued to function in a way such that the information processing systems that we currently have remains the same and is sensitive to the same stimuli as those had by our ancestors. Suppose we take that claim about the genetic claim to mean something like behaviors are heritable in the ways in which we ought to be understanding heritable, or typically the ways in which we understand heritable. So you might think that we have that we are bipedal systems is a straightforward matter of heritability, and it's heritability that is perfect, dare I use a non-biological term. One way in which we might think about behaviors in the present is generated by information processing modules that exist in the present is to say that we have determined thus because experiments have shown that there is a genetic effect on the frequency of the particular behaviors that we're interested in. Now, what I think is important to understand in my case, I'm not merely talking about a behavioral domain where we're talking about something like predator avoidance. What is important is that the idea I'm going after here, the option that I'm thinking about that is generous to evolutionary psychologists in particular, is that they have in fact done experiments where they have shown that there is this kind of a frequency of the particular behavior in a population. Now, heritability is always about population. A second reading of the claim, the genetic claim, might be that behaviors are influenced by genes. And a third might be that behaviors are produced by a regulatory mechanism the regulatory mechanism is influenced by suites of genes. So I sort of see the genetic claim as being decomposed into roughly 3 kinds. I'll say a little bit of something about 2 and 3, but most of what I have to say next will be about 1. It is clear that we should be thinking that just as we've inherited the genotypes and the phenotypic characteristics, some of our phenotypic characteristics from the marriage of our parents' biological material, that inheritance of behaviors is, or at least the mechanisms that produce behaviors, is what is being gestured at here. But obviously, we know that one of the reasons evolutionary psychology emerged on the scene was precisely because the sociobiological turn that they rejected was not apt for the job, that no one believed that it is behaviors themselves that are inherited, but rather that it is mechanisms, it is these modules that were laid down. In fact, Cosmedi and Tooby, they talk about the fact that we have a Gray's Anatomy, a textbook that tells us about the body, tells us about the form and structure and functioning organs of the body that I think everyone who goes to medical school has been exposed to. They believe, in fact, I tell my students that they give us an IOU. The IOU is that in the future, they envisage a situation in which there will be something like a Gray's Anatomy enumerating the cognitive structures of the mind, these structures that have been laid down by evolution and that they have these specialized functions. So it's not merely that they are giving us something cheap. Their evolutionary psychological understanding is very expensive epistemically. And so, when I take the genetic claim to be such, it's precisely because what they are talking about is inheritance. But obviously, if we take the inheritance route, there isn't the kind of inheritance between behavior and prototypical phenotypes like hair color, eye color, etc. Something else is going on. So rather than think in terms of inheritance, I'm saying that it can't be inheritance that is the target, it must be heritability. And so they must be talking about heritability as we talk about heritability and heritability estimates. And when we talk about heritability, we're usually talking about, obviously, evolution. We must be talking about population. Heritability is only ever understood in, it only ever pertains to variation. So the thought would be that amongst the population of people, there are people who are exhibiting behaviors, predator avoidance behavior of a particular sort, and these predator avoidance behavior of a particular sort appear amongst some of those people who have certain particular genes as well. So there's something like, the way it's typically framed, that there's sort of a correlation between certain kinds of behaviors and genes that are possessed by certain people in those populations. Among other members in the population, there will be differential behaviors. There will be other kinds of behaviors for us to make these, in order for them to make these heritability measures and estimates. So the first claim, the first understanding of the genetic claim can't be about inheritance merely of cognitive modules. Even if it is, it's an IOU that is not being established. There's no empirical bona fides to secure this claim. There is a gap between the claim that the modules that our ancestors had and that we have, that these are in some sense similar or the same. The only target, therefore, that we have for thinking about the modules in terms of genetics is to go heritability route, to my view. And when we go heritability route, we are in deep, deep trouble, because we're going to have to look at heritability estimates. We're talking about heritability estimates, and that need not tell us anything at all about behaviors being underwritten by particular suites of genes. All that we will get from these estimates is that particular kinds of behaviors are found in people or from people that have particular kinds of genes in sort of a correlatory kind of relationship, not a causal relationship. The genetic claim of necessity is a causal claim. It is a claim about how it is that we get to behave as we do in the contemporary world with respect to certain things, that we exhibit certain kinds of behaviors under certain conditions. And of course, this is setting aside how we are going to, how general we are going to conceive of the behaviors, the candidate behaviors. But even if we grant a very narrow framing of those behavior, or a very wide framing of those behaviors, what is still common is that those behaviors are underwritten by some mechanism that itself was inherited genetically. And of course, in order for that to be substantiated, we certainly need more than the mere assertion that there is that such mechanisms are in place. Option 2 and option 3 are in some sense different, but they are similar. Here too, I think that these are actually sort of, 2 is really a cheap version. It's really getting some epistemic security for very, very cheap. In other words, this is sort of contentless evolutionary theorizing. One way in which we could think of it is someone saying that everything about us, or at least with respect to our behaviors, evolution's got something to do with it. And I'm inclined to say, tell me something I don't know. Of course, the fact that I say that might suggest that, Subrena, so you are granting that evolution has got something to do with it. Well, very, very generally. We are here as these kinds of systems because of evolutionary forces. But that's a really long way from saying that I'm wearing this blue dress today, evolution's got something to do with it. Well, there's a way in which that's true, but it is getting evolutionary theorizing on the cheap. And nobody wants that, and evolutionary psychologists don't want that. They're too sophisticated to want that. So 2 has to go. 3, behaviors are produced by a regulatory mechanism that is influenced by suites of genes. So we have sort of a 2-step system here. This 2-step system, again, it's consequential, it's empirical, it's that there is, in fact, some kind of a regulatory machinery that stands between behaviors that produces behaviors, or that is in the business of bringing it about such that we have certain kinds of behaviors. And prior to that, that regulatory machinery itself is influenced by genes. It's less cheap than the second option, but it too, it's sort of more steps for saying not a lot more, because all we're doing is saying, well, rather than just run from evolution to genes and genes to behavior, we're saying, well, actually there's, a fancy regulatory machinery, and, that machinery, it's really what's bringing behaviors about, but that itself, that is really controlled by genes. So it's really a fancy way, a mouthful way of saying not more than you have said with the second option. So the real issue, as I see, with respect to this epistemic gap is with 1, what are we getting when we take this genetic claim? It can't be inheritance as I understand it. So the best candidate then is heritability estimates, but heritability estimates does not put us in a better situation. We're not going to be epistemically better off. We have not established empirically, though it seems as if we have, because in principle, this is really something that we can do. We can actually go into a population. Let me just say as an aside, what exactly counts as a population with respect to this issue is going to be relevant too. Because if we're talking about biological populations, then not any old genes that from any old combination of people is going to be is going to work. It seems to me that if we're talking about a biological population, we might actually want to find people in populations that that are more apt to be genetically similar than not. Let's put it like this. So 2 and 3, again, cheap versions or cheap ways of getting our genetic claim. One is substantive, but is deeply, deeply problematic. Okay, so you might have noticed if you read my paper that I am still pressing the matching problem. And as I say, I'm really trying to develop this, and I will have more hopefully later, not in this talk, but later on, maybe next year I'll have a paper ready that zooms in on this particular issue. And I just want to sort of remind, bring things back to the matching problem. The matching problem, as I articulated, says that for a present day psychological trait to be related to an ancestral psychological trait or structure or module, in the way that evolutionary psychology requires, the present day trait must be of the same kind as the ancestral one. And I say that it must also have the same function as the ancestral one and must be descended from the ancestral trait as part of a reproductive lineage extending back to prehistory. This is all about genetic causal consequences. Also importantly, the present day trait and the ancestral trait must be of the same kind that have the same function, because the former is descended from the latter. This is key because it might be that a present day trait and an ancestral trait are of the same kind and have the same function without being descended from the other. So the architecture of the modern mind might, of course, resemble that of early humans without this architecture having been selected for and genetically transmitted through the generations, right? So you see why the genetic framing of this matter, and there's no other way to go. Once you are in the evolution business, you are in the land of genetics. However, you might think that you would be satisfied with a genetics of the 2 or 3 version, in which case we simply wouldn't have such fully developed industries that is aimed at giving evolutionary accounts of human behavior. Why one is the only game in town where inheritance is the candidate, and therefore why, if inheritance is the candidate, evolutionary thinkers must meet the epistemic challenge, has to be the only live game in town. That was a very extended, long kind of sentence. But the point I'm wanting to say is the fruitful avenue to pursue to see if we can make sense of what is needed to satisfy an epistemic gap has to be the first analysis that I offer. Evolutionary psychological claims, therefore, fail unless practitioners can show that mental structures underpinning present-day behaviors are structures that evolved in prehistory for the performance of adaptive tasks that it is still their function to perform. This I call the matching problem. Because of these challenges, the forecasted gains from an evolutionary treatment of extant human behavior is not in the offing. Unless there is an approach that gets over the matching problem, I don't believe that the epistemic gap can be closed. Now, it sounds as if I'm saying, and I probably will get questions to this effect, that there's no place in the space of theorizing human behavior for an evolutionary treatment. And some people who know me know that I privately know that I harbor this view. It's not one that I've explicitly put out there until now. I'm not apt to thinking that behaviors are candidates for evolutionary treatment. And the reason I say this is precisely because of the nature of behavior. So behaviors are the sorts of things that are highly contingent. They must be sensitive to the facts on the ground, or else they fail to do their jobs. One of the things that we know evolution would have fashioned us to be sensitive to noting when and where we ought to behave in certain ways. However, which ways we behave is going to be entirely novel to the situations given the facts on the ground. So that's one sort of position that I have. But I also think that the idea of reading off from our ancestors passed to us is so highly suspect, because what I think we get in the end is something like very cheap evolutionary theorizing that goes something like, surely we are related to them in important respects. And one important respects is that we are here as their beneficiaries. We know this because we're here. It follows, therefore, that they had to have acted in ways that guaranteed that they were reproducers. They did act in ways that resulted in their being producers. So we must have inherited, among other things, the behavioral platform that they had. I'm not sold on that particular kind